contradiction. Was Jesus crucified the day after Passover or before the Passover meal? The three synoptic Gospels note Jesus' Last Supper was the Passover meal, and then he was arrested and crucified the next day, which would be Friday. However, John's Gospel seems to suggest Jesus died before the Passover in certain places, like in John 18:28, where the priests would not enter Pilate's headquarters because they would have been defiled and could not eat the Passover, in John 19:14, which says it was the day of preparation for the Passover. So this would mean, according to John, Jesus had to die on Thursday. So does John's Gospel contradict the Synoptics? Well, it is possible, but there are a lot of issues that scholar Craig Bloomberg points out with assuming John contradicts the Synoptics. Bloomberg argues John actually is in agreement with the Synoptics that Jesus died on Friday, not before the Passover meal on Thursday, and we can see this if we look at the full context and not just these two verses. First, we need to remember the full context of John. Chapters 13 to 17 are considered to be lengthy instructions given by Jesus to his disciples at the Last Supper. Then in chapter 18, they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Notice how chapter 13 begins. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Then verse 2 begins with, during supper. It seems natural to understand this is a reference to the meal just announced in the prior verse. Craig Bloomberg says, verses 1 to 2 would thus describe the depths of the love Jesus already had for his disciples before the Passover. Such love led him to see his mission through to the end, culminating in the Last Supper. Next, we need to remember the word Passover typically did not refer to just the Passover meal, but also to the Passover week. Passover was not just one meal, but a week-long celebration. In fact, this seems to be how John uses the term throughout his Gospel, referring to the entire festival of Passover, not just the opening meal. This makes more sense with what follows in chapter 13. In verse 29, some disciples believe Judas left so he could buy provisions for the feast. And the word John uses typically refers to the week-long festival, not the initial meal. It would seem odd if he was going out to buy perishable food for the Passover supper 24 hours too early. That would have spoiled overnight. That was typically done the day of the meal. It makes more sense to realize some thought Judas was buying provisions used throughout the week, not specifically food for the initial Passover meal the next day. Second, others there also speculated that Judas was going out to give alms to the poor. This would be unlikely on a random night, but on the first night of Passover, almsgiving was explicitly commanded. Josephus even tells us temple gates were left open so the poor could gather and receive alms. So this suspicion they had also makes more sense if John assumed they were eating the initial Passover meal, not a supper prior to the Passover meal. But what about verse 18:28, where it says the Jewish leaders didn't want to be defiled so they could eat the Passover? Well, despite the surface level reading, this actually doesn't make sense with the idea John was referring to the initial Passover meal on Thursday, because Leviticus 15:5-11 gave the stipulation that defilement incurred during daylight hours would expire at sunset, which is when the initial Passover meal began. So the priests didn't have to worry about defilement if what they were concerned about was the initial Passover meal on Thursday night. However, if they didn't want to be defiled for a Passover meal that happened on Friday midday, called the Haggadah, that would actually make far more sense. Thus, their fear of being defiled would also confirm John is claiming Jesus was crucified on Friday, and not prior to the initial Passover meal on Thursday. 2 Chronicles 35 seems to suggest later offerings and meals during the Passover week could also be called the Passover. Bloomberg says, it is true that the later meals are not singled out apart from the initial Passover dinner, but if John has already narrated the first meal, readers would understand that it could not be included again. Finally, what about John 19:14, where it directly says it was the day of preparation for the Passover? Well, this seems to be a misunderstanding. John is probably not saying it was the day of preparation for the Passover meal, but the day of preparation during the Passover week. The standard Greek word for the day of preparation was used to refer to Friday, since that was the day before the Sabbath, and the Jews were preparing for it. So John is probably just noting it was Friday during the Passover week. That is, the day of preparation for the Sabbath during Passover week. This is actually the case in all four Gospels and other works. Matthew 27:62 refers to Friday as the day of preparation. Mark 15:42 says Friday was called the day of preparation. Luke 23:54 yet again says Friday was called the day of preparation. The same can be seen in the Didache and the martyrdom of Polycarp. Plus, if we read just past verse 14, both John 19:31 and 19:42 directly say it was the day of preparation, and that meant it was the day before the Sabbath, making it Friday. Thus, the context shows John 19:14 probably also just means the day of preparation during Passover, not the day of preparation for the initial Passover meal. So as you can see, this attempt to claim John is in disagreement with the synoptics is based on quote mining. Once we look at the full context, we can see John is in agreement with the synoptic Gospels that Jesus' Last Supper was the initial Passover meal, and that he died on Friday. Thus, this supposed contradiction can be resolved.